Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I call this joint hearing of the Readiness and Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittees of the House Armed Services Committee to order. First, I would like to honor the 17 sailors who were lost in the USS Fitzgerald. Sailors Shingo Douglas, Noe Hernandez, Nak Chu Ang Hun, Xavier Martin, Gary Rame, Dakota Rigsby, Carlos Victor Su Bai Un, and the 10 USS John S. McCain sailors, Kevin Bushell, Dustin Doyen, Jacob Drake, Timothy Eccles Jr., Charles Finley, John Hoagland, Corey Ingram, Abraham Lopez, Kenneth Smith, Logan Palmer, and each one of them is so special to, I know, every person here. Over the course of the past 6 months, our subcommittees have met with Navy leadership to understand the causal factors that have led to 4 gruesome and tragic incidents involving surface ships, resulting in the deaths of 17 sailors. I remain confident that our Navy remains the most powerful in the world. However, the Navy is not alone in responsibility. As Secretary James Mattis stated in August, quote, "It just creates unpredictability. It makes us rigid. We cannot deal with new and revealing threats. We know our enemies are not standing still," end of quote. Passing another temporary measure compounds the negative impacts for our military. Some of those impacts are highlighted by the manning, training, and certification gaps necessitated by increased operational demand. Speaker Paul Ryan and Chairman Mac Thornberry have been clear and outspoken in promoting the critical need for a robust year-long defense appropriations bill. I fully believe the primary responsibility of the national government is to provide for the national security of its citizens, and that is especially true of our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines. Therefore, it is our responsibility as members of these subcommittees to better understand the readiness situation and how the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review and Comprehensive Review are informing and assisting the Department of the Navy in correcting any deficiencies and shortfalls. This week, the Navy announced additional actions for shipboard personnel involved in these collisions. Separate from these military actions, this committee remains concerned that senior officers who created the conditions for ships to not receive depot-level repairs, the individuals who chose to repeatedly approve waivers of expired certifications, and the individuals who had the ability to balance and globally resource operational requirements are not being held accountable. Today, the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Richard Spencer, and the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, are here to testify to the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review and the comprehensive review for our hearing on surface warfare at a crossroads. I remain concerned about the Navy's training and certification processes, the approach to correcting any deficiencies and shortfalls, and the Navy's approach to improve accountability. I hope that today's hearing will address these concerns. I would like now to turn to our ranking member, Congresswoman Madeline Badillo of Guam, for any remarks she may desire to make.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wilson and Chairman Whitman, for convening this important joint hearing on Navy's readiness. And thank you also to Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson for being here today. Following several mishaps in 2017 involving U.S. Navy ships, you each directed separate parallel reviews of surface fleet operations and readiness. The Strategic Readiness Review and the Fleet Comprehensive Review are important steps aimed at identifying and addressing the challenges that our Navy is facing today. However, actions speak louder than words, and we must ensure that the recommendations included in these reviews are promptly considered and acted upon to improve the readiness of the fleet and prevent a repeat of the tragedies of 2017. Today's hearing is the first opportunity for members of this committee to discuss the recommendations of these 2 reviews. However, this committee's oversight of these issues will not end with today's hearings. I hope that members of this committee can continue a frank and an open dialogue with the Navy's leadership as progress is made toward implementing these reviews' recommendations. Without question, I think my colleagues would agree that the U.S. Navy is the most powerful fleet in the world. However, in the light of recent global events and the escalation of near-peer threats around the world, we must ensure that the Navy is properly manned, trained, and equipped to conduct the missions that may be asked of them. As highlighted by the 4 incidents of 2017, the high operational tempo and the lack of emphasis on ship maintenance and training have chipped away at the overall readiness of the fleet. One element of Navy readiness that I am particularly concerned about is ship maintenance, and specifically for ships operating in the Pacific. Over the past several years, we have engaged senior Navy leaders regarding the Navy's readiness requirements in the Western Pacific, specifically in depot-level ship repair and dry dock capabilities and capacity. In the Fleet Comprehensive Review, the Navy identified capacity issues at the ship repair facility in Yokosuka, Japan. To our witnesses, I look forward today to hearing how the Navy plans to address the ship repair capacity issue in the Pacific and improve the material condition of the fleet. Furthermore, I also look forward to hearing how that plan will align with the President's 2018 National Security Strategy to maintain a forward military presence capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating any adversary, which will be balanced with an economic strategy that rejuvenates the domestic economy. In addition to supporting proper ship maintenance, we must also ensure our surface warfare officers and sailors are receiving adequate training to perform the missions that are asked of them. We must empower ship commanding officers to express concerns up their chain of command without facing career-ending repercussions when they are tasked with a mission that they feel their ship or crew are not properly trained for. This is a management and a cultural issue for the Navy's leadership to address. And to that end, I look forward to hearing your plans to ensure sufficient time is allocated for training and maintenance, 2 pillars for restoring the Navy's surface readiness. I fear that will be a long journey to return to proper readiness levels, but I do assure you that this committee will try to help you where we can. Similarly, we will not hesitate to raise concerns and issues with you as we perform our oversight role. I believe the Navy is in good hands, and I look forward to staying updated on the progress of your work to restore readiness across the fleet. And I look forward today, this afternoon, to your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mardillo. I now turn to the gentleman from Virginia and Chairman of the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee, Congressman Rob Whitman, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding. And I want to thank Secretary Spencer, Admiral Richardson for joining us today and for being part of what I think is a very needed and, I think, productive process to go through to make sure that we are making the necessary course changes to address this issue. Let me begin by quoting Dr. James Holmes. He's a noted Navy War College professor, and he recently wrote an article entitled, "Who Watches the Watchers in the United States Navy?" In this article, he expressed concern about the apparent lack of accountability for the structural problems in the surface warfare community. He indicated that the Navy is quick in citing senior leadership's loss of confidence in commanding officers, but is at best circumspect when assessing fault to the system that drove these commanding officers to seek what he calls the normalization of deviation. This culture of holding the commanding officer accountable is very apparent with the decision announced on Tuesday to bring the commanding officers and other officials from the USS Fitzgerald and McCain before an Article 32 hearing for negligent homicide. While I agree with the Navy that officers should be held accountable, I'm equally convinced that we need to reform the system that drove these officers to avoid additional incidents and to reduce future normalization of deviation instances. I think the Navy has taken a tremendously important and good first step at addressing these systematic areas, but there are a multitude of other issues that need to be reviewed to include organization reform, manning deficiencies, materiel readiness, and serious training reform. While the Comprehensive Review and Strategic Readiness Review have identified the organizational problems facing the Navy, I think it is time to take bold steps in correcting the deficiencies that were identified almost 15 years ago. It's time to flatten the organization and centralize the Title X manning, training, and equipping authorities at Fleet Forces Command. It is time to reactivate the Second Fleet and eliminate Fourth Fleet to ensure the Navy retains an emphasis on deployment credibility. It is time that we consolidate Navy policy intellect by co-locating the 3-star type commanders at Fleet Forces Command. And it is time for Congress to end restrictions that contributed to the 7th Fleet disorganization and allow the Navy to effectively reorganize. I'm particularly disappointed with the manning levels of our forward deployed naval forces, particularly concerning the disparity between different ship classes. I do not understand why forward deployed naval forces are the worst manned forces in the surface Navy. They need to be the best. With regard to training, I am concerned that as our ships become more technically challenging to operate, our surface warfare community has retained a generalist preference that contributes to the surface warfare malaise. I think it is time that we adopt specialists similar to the aviation community and foreign navies. We should require surface warfare officers to specialize in deck or engineering and allow needed junior officers time to develop basic skills. Further, the Navy should consider adopting certification milestones similar to the commercial sector. The U.S. Navy needs to significantly improve the surface warfare pipeline to ensure Navy officers are provided basic navigation and engineering skills. Finally, as to correcting material issues, I think it is time that we start to take our in-serve process seriously and correct the material problems facing the forward deployed naval forces. In-serve is a statutorily driven process that provides Congress and our nation a snapshot of the material condition of the fleet. I am concerned that the classification of the in-serve reports fails to provide our nation a reasonable perspective of the negative consequences associated with underfunding the readiness accounts. Navy should be prepared to publicly articulate the risk of our surface ship maintenance, and we need to ensure that forward deployed Navy forces are properly maintained with a competent workforce that has the capacity and skills to maintain the fleet. It is time that we routinely rotate ships back to the United States that have been forward deployed for over 20 years. We have significant challenges that face our surface forces, but with time and resolve, I am confident that we can right the surface forces that are perilously askew. As to Dr. Holmes' question as to who watches the watchers, I want to unambiguously answer that this committee will continue to drive toward accountability and providing solutions to the systemic problems that face the surface warfare community. We will watch the watchers. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Whitman. And now to the gentleman from Connecticut and ranking member of the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee, Congressman Joe Courtney, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson for your presence here today to update our subcommittees and the American people on the result of your reviews of last year's Navy ship collisions. This is the fourth engagement that we've held on this topic since last fall, which is of the highest urgency given the unacceptable level of fatalities in non-combat settings which occurred in 2017. For many members, even those who hail from districts far from the Western Pacific, these collisions strike home. In Connecticut, two outstanding sailors, electronics technician second class Dustin Doyen of Suffield and sonar technician second class Nap Chung Wen of Watertown, Connecticut, lost their lives. Given this drastic harm, it is the duty of all of us to ensure that bold systemic change happens to protect our sailors and ships from similar tragedies in the future. Last week at the Surface Navy Association annual symposium held just across the Potomac in Virginia, a panel of young officers assigned to forward deployed ships in Japan discussed the challenges they face maintaining readiness in the 7th Fleet. They described high operational tempo, the challenge of simultaneous training and operations, and long hours. Their most powerful comments, however, described a system in which they could not even be certain they understood the risks that they were taking. One junior officer stated that following the collisions of the Fitzgerald and the McCain, he asked himself, "I'm certified for my position, but do I actually know what I'm doing?" Another officer, when considering the relatively incident-free deployment he had just returned home from, asked, "Are we good at this, or are we just lucky?" These anguished statements describe issues which go far beyond the particulars of any one ship. They speak to systemic problems in operations, training, and management of our surface forces. The comprehensive review and strategic review make dozens of recommendations for changes and reforms that are needed inside the Navy. After meeting with each of you, it is clear that many of these recommendations have been or are in the process of being implemented internally in real time. I urge you to continue to make the implementation of these recommendations a top priority and to keep Congress and the families of our lost sailors updated on your progress. Other recommendations, however, will need Congress's direct attention and action. For example, one of the areas where both reviews agree is that Congress has contributed to these systemic readiness issues in the surface forces. Specifically, recent defense appropriations bills have carried language which restricts the Navy from realigning its man, train, and equip functions under a single command. These congressionally mandated command and control restrictions have allowed an unusual situation to continue in the Pacific Fleet, which is responsible for both deploying forces and determining when those forces are ready to deploy, and to do so separate from the rest of the fleet. As the result of your respective reviews, and as they've made clear, this arrangement allowed ships to be deployed without basic certifications and without meaningful plans to mitigate the risk to our sailors. While there is disagreement in the comprehensive review and strategic review about the best actual command and control structure for Navy surface forces, it is clear that continued congressional limitation in this area is a hindrance to the management and readiness of the fleet. Even before these recent collisions, Congress had seriously considered changes to this restrictive language. In 2016, the House voted unanimously to remove the provision completely, but it was later restored by the Senate in the 2016 NDAA and appropriations bill. It is my hope that we can once again work on a bipartisan basis to remove these restrictions from our funding bills and to see these efforts through to the end. Your input here today will be invaluable in that effort. The other obvious mission Congress can execute is to restore budget stability for the Navy. We need repair work to move forward in a timely manner. We need to increase the supply of combat-ready ships available to Fleet Forces Command rather than letting shipbuilding plans languish because of CRs. The federal government has operated under CRs in 8 of the last 12 months, and it appears this week that that number is likely to grow to 9 out of 13. This is hardly the roadmap to a 355-ship Navy. I think I speak for my colleagues in saying that we stand ready to assist our witnesses today to create bold new institutional change. We owe it to the memory of the sailors we've lost, we owe it to their families, and we owe it to those forward deployed sailors who are asking themselves today, am I just lucky? I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Courtney. We're grateful that Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming is present with us today. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's briefing after all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Is there any objection? Hearing none, without objection, the non-subcommittee members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. Secretary Richard Spencer, we now turn to you for your remarks and briefing on the incidents.
Chairman Whitman and Wilson, Ranking Member Courtney and Bordeo, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having us here today to talk about our reviews and how we're moving forward. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't start by saying that we should keep the sailors lost on McCain and Fitzgerald in our thoughts and prayers as we go forward. Over the past year, our surface fleet has continued to operate and train around the globe, filling a strong demand signal to help preserve our national security. At the same time, however, those operations have led to some tragic losses. Those losses demand that we take time to study, understand, make course corrections to ensure the safety of our most valuable resource, which is people. As you are well aware, we lost 20 sailors in major incidents in the Pacific last year. The loss of any sailor is a tragedy. All of us in the Department of the Navy stand in solidarity and support of our fellow sailors and families. I am here today as the responsible one and accountable for our most valuable resources. To fulfill these responsibilities, I'm directing change across the Fleet and Marine Corps to correct the issues identified in our analysis of those intolerable events. Both the comprehensive and strategic readiness reviews sought to identify factors that led to last year's accidents. The comprehensive review focused on the causal factors and underlying conditions at the tactical and operational levals, while the Strategic Readiness Review examined broader systemic and root causes. The Strategic Readiness Review found that the discovered deficiencies were not traceable to any single policy or decision, but were cumulative results of decisions aimed at achieving short-term goals. Overall, the review team found that accepting deviations from our standards, which translates into higher risks, had gradually become normalized and therefore compounding accumulated risks. This must and will be corrected. As we move forward, success will not be attained overnight. My leadership team and I are working closely with the Navy Marine Corps team to examine, adopt, and implement recommendations from these reviews. The CNO will address remedial actions we have taken to restore us to an environment of safety and sustainability. Simultaneously, we are working through implementation plans for all of the reviews, the Strategic Readiness Review's recommendations. As we do so, we are addressing issues that fit into 5 categories: command and control, operations, manning and training, governance, and culture and learning. Many of the review's recommended corrective actions are within my authority to implement as Secretary of the Navy. Some, however, will require coordination with the Office of the Secretary of Defense as well as with you, the Congress. The most important step that you could take now that would help us restore the health of the Navy is to give us stable and adequate funding. We must be able to count on reliable resourcing to operate safely and efficiently. Despite these challenges, I want to assure you that the Navy Marine Corps team is still the most ready, capable, and lethal force in our arsenal. We know, however, that staying that way means we must seize every opportunity to improve, and we are committed to do so. We stand with the families of the fallen and their loved ones. Their repeated request that good must come out of these cathartic events rings true throughout our enterprise on a daily basis. We must act with a sense of urgency to grow our competitive advantage in a sustainable manner, and I look forward to working with you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. And we now turn to Admiral John Richardson for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson, Chairman Whitman, Ranking Members Bordaio and Courtney, and distinguished members of the Readiness and Seapower subcommittees. I want to thank you for the opportunity to brief you today on our unified action plan to address the systemic issues identified in both the Comprehensive Review and Secretary Spencer's Strategic Readiness Review. Looking back, 2017 was a year of both triumph and tragedy for our Navy. We consistently forward deployed more than 60,000 sailors and 95 ships and submarines around the globe to protect America from attack, advance our nation's interests, and enhance our economic prosperity and strategic influence. But even as we achieved these successes, we were reminded of the unforgiving nature of operating at sea. Our Navy experienced 5 serious incidents in the Pacific, resulting in the loss of 20 dedicated sailors, American patriots all. And our thoughts and prayers remain with our fallen shipmates and their families. And as we have said, our investigations revealed that these tragedies were due in large part to human error and failures in leadership as we took our eye off mastering the basics in seamanship and navigation. And we owe it to our fallen sailors, our active duty sailors, and our loved ones who support us to quickly and forcefully apply these lessons learned through corrective action, and that's exactly what we're doing. I testified before this committee in November on the findings of the Comprehensive Review led by Admiral Phil Davidson, Commander of the U.S. Fleet Forces Command. As I outlined in my written statement, we've already acted on many of the report's 58 recommendations. Additionally, I established an oversight board chaired by the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Bill Moran, to track the completion of those actions that remain in progress. Things like command and control, surface warfare officer career paths, training, equipment, and certifications. Finally, as the Chief of Naval Operations, I am responsible for crushing any obstacles that prevent our sailors from achieving warfighting and safe operations at sea. So to get a deck plate perspective on our progress, in December I visited our naval forces in Korea, Japan, Bahrain, and the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group on station in the Persian Gulf. And through my interactions with thousands of our sailors, it's clear to me that these incidents do not define your Navy. It would be a grave, even lethal mistake to underestimate our capability and dedication. And it was also clear that our corrective action are already having a positive impact. But there's more work to do, and we'll get it done. And we'll get it done briskly, learning from our mistakes, capturing our successes, sharing those insights across the force, and improving upon our best every day. And we'll do so, as the Secretary said, with a sense of urgency. By dedicating our hearts and minds, we will finish 2018 as the safest Navy in the world for our sailors, the favored partner in the world for our friends and allies, and the most lethal Navy in the world for our enemies. Before I close, I can't in good conscience testify before Congress about naval power without mentioning the toxic and corrosive effect of 9 years of continuing resolutions and years under the Budget Control Act. We are getting after the work we have to do, but the absence of stable and adequate funding for defense makes everything that our sailors and their commanders do harder. On a scale of 1 to 10, the importance of stable and adequate funding scores an 11. On behalf of our sailors, their families, and our Navy civilians, I thank the Congress, and especially these subcommittees, for your continued support in providing us the Navy our nation needs. And I look forward to working with you and answering your questions. With that, I'd like to pass it back to the Secretary.
Thank you, CNO. Mr. Chairman, I took, when you've taken a brief on the comprehensive review behind closed doors, and I know I met with a couple of you on the committee to explain the SRR. Would it be worthwhile for me to just do a 2 or 3 minute overview on the strategic review?
I think it would be very helpful, yes. Please proceed.
Thank you. After the accident occurred, the CNO and I both decided to take the path that we took, which was to immediately set up a review of the tactical and operational areas where we had to investigate due to these accidents. I took it upon myself to say, okay, let's go a little higher at 30,000 feet and see if we can go after the systemic and root causes. We engaged Michael Baer, who's actually here today, former chairman of the Defense Business Board, and Admiral Gary Ruffhead to chair the strategic review. They went back and looked at 30 years of data to assess our present state of play and really look at systemic issues that are affecting us. We looked outside. We had them look outside to industry, and this is kind of an interesting point that I'd like to present to those that didn't hear the brief. We incorporated people such as Crowley Marine. You might call that fairly obvious. They sail on the seas also. They had a series of events that were unproductive for them, and they turned inside and re-examined how they did work, and they came out the other side as a poster child, according to the Merchant Marine Academy, of an organization that upholds safety. We talked to Maersk, which also had some events happen to it that were cathartic, and they actually went through the same path and came out the other side. Boeing, in their industrial floors, in increasing their capacity to produce, found that they were also running into areas where they were hurting their human resources, and they put a plan in place and came out the other side. BP North America, needless to say, we all knew the Deepwater Horizon event. They also went through the same. What is the common link here? It is organizations that had cathartic events that threatened them. We called them up, their CEOs, and asked if they would help us in our analysis on the strategic readiness review. And they were more than forthcoming to send us all the assets we needed, including all the plans that came out on the other side. Didn't need the plans, wanted to speak to the people who went from the journey from cathartic event to the development of the plans. We wanted to see how they got to where they got. One of the other people that we incorporated, which was quite interesting, was the Mayo Clinic. And you might say, how can you connect the Mayo Clinic to sailing on the blue waters? It's interesting. They had been doing some studies over the past 3 years, and we contacted John Noseworthy, the CEO of Mayo Clinic. They looked at long-term complex operations in the operating room, and they wanted to improve the outcomes. Think organ transplant, Think very complex operations, 7, 8 hours. The traditional mindset and operating environment was chief surgeon would raise his or her scalpel and go, is everyone ready? Here we go. Put the head down and start working along the way. The professional teams in the room, the cardiac, the pulmonologist, the cardiac analysis, the anesthesiologist, were all working along one step behind, or if in fact equal at best. They found that there was not a door open to turn around and say, need a minute here, we're falling behind, need to double set something. They decompressed and decomposed the whole culture of the operating room and basically reset it, where the lead surgeon would lift up his or her knife and go, is everybody with me? We're ready. And then every 1 or 2 minutes, sit there and go, are we still all together? The environment for communication as the mission went forward was wide open. We saw a direct applicability to the bridge of a ship, the engineering department of a ship, and we incorporated that into the study. 23 recommendations ranging from command and control to culture to modeling came forth. We're in the process now of actually triaging those recommendations. We've had our first meeting to date, which we addressed command and control. We can go into that a little bit later, but we're moving out on that as the CNO has moved out with his CR. I just wanted to give you all an overview as to what we actually did in the strategic review and the outcomes, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. As we proceed, we'll be under a 5-minute rule so that we have as much opportunity as we can for each of the subcommittee members who are here. And this will be maintained by our professional staff member, Margaret Dean, who herself is a very valued member of the Navy Reserve. The first question, and of course the timing begins on me, and that is the forward, for each of you, the forward deployed naval forces have critical operational demands that took the USS Fitzgerald and USS John S. McCain away from dedicated maintenance, training, and certification periods. What steps has the Navy taken to ensure that this is not continuing to occur with the remaining forward deployed naval forces? Is the Navy reviewing current sourcing requirements? Additionally, has the Navy coordinated with the combatant commanders to validate or review current mandatory sourcing requirements? How is the Navy leadership communicating an inability to resource or risk associated with resourcing the COCOM requirements? And for each of you.
Sir, I'll begin on this. The simple answer is that particularly the forward deployed naval forces in Japan have taken a look at the force generation process, the process by which they maintain and train and certify forces for the missions to which they're assigned. And so we started by rebaselining every cruiser and destroyer that is in the forward deployed naval force in Japan, so that first and foremost, every ship that is underway right now has been assessed to be ready for those missions. And then it's a matter of just sticking to that plan so that we do provide sufficient time to maintain the ships. When they get out, there's sufficient time and attention given to training and certifying those ships before they get assigned to their missions. And so just that scheduled discipline has been established and enforced by Admiral Sawyer, the new commander of the 7th Fleet. With respect to meeting combatant commander demands, sir, as you're very well aware, we've not been close as a joint force meeting combatant commander demands for a decade. We traditionally meet about 50% of the requested forces, and that's not just the Navy, that's across the joint force. So there's a constant adjudication that goes on to find the priority missions, and we're doing that mindful that the forces have to be trained and certified before they go.
My only addition to that, Mr. Chairman, would be think of the Mayo Clinic example I just brought up right now. The CNO and I are in lockstep when it comes to man, train, equip, that we have an atmosphere that people can speak up. And I don't use the word no, I use the phrase not today. It might be ready tomorrow, it might be ready in a week, but it is upon us to have that, instill that environment within our organization to make it that much of a more reactive and effective organization.
Yeah. Sir, if I could just pile off of this as long as we're talking about this. Those conversations have happened today and have happened, right? This is not a Navy where there's a cultural inhibition to having that happen. And those officers have gone on to have fruitful careers and promotions and everything else. So this is, these types of conversations happen in our Navy right now, have been happening for some time. So it is possible to have this without career implications.
Additionally, investigation documents indicate that the shipboard, squadron, and fleet leadership were properly reporting on training and materiel deficiencies and requesting relief, yet these individuals were fired. How is the Surface Warfare Navy addressing the culture of accountability and empowering commanders to highlight deficiencies and properly inform the chain of command or risk associated with these decisions without facing punitive action?
Sir, I'll tell you, this goes right to what it means to be in command. And so when personnel were held accountable, and that went up to the 7th Fleet Commander, so this was not restricted to the unit level, right? And this level of accountability, frankly, hasn't been, at that senior level, has not really occurred since World War II. And so in terms of watching the watchers, we're with you on that. The accountability actions addressed those things for which those commanders were, they had complete ownership. They had the responsibility, accountability, and authority to act to avoid the series of decisions that resulted in either a collision or an assignment of a ship that wasn't ready to do its mission. And so each one of those was appreciated on its individual merit, and I strongly believe that the accountability measures were appropriate.
And these are being monitored still, the deficiencies and the requests made?
Yes, sir. It's a part of a constant dialogue there, particularly with the 7th Fleet the new 7th Fleet leadership in place.
Thank you. We now proceed to Ranking Member Badayo of Guam.
Mr. Secretary, I strongly support the national security strategy's intent to keep our forces forward deployed. In the Navy's 2 reviews, as well as previous discussions I've had with Navy leadership, concerns have been raised about the gaps in the capability and the capacity to support ship repair requirements in the Western Pacific. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the comprehensive review specifically identifies this as a real challenge for SRF Yokosuka, Japan. So with that concern in mind, can you please discuss what additional options are being considered to meet ship maintenance requirements for Navy ships operating in the Western Pacific? Whether we are discussing peacetime or a potential contingency, it seems to me that a ship repair facility on sovereign U.S. soil in the Western Pacific, and we all know where that is, would be capable of supporting depot-level maintenance, and this would be an ideal solution to meet ship maintenance requirements while keeping them forward in the region. So what options, Mr. Secretary, are you discussing to meet these needs?
Congresswoman Burdett, thank you. We are looking at all options at all times. You and I met earlier, I think last week. The fact of the matter is, if in fact we pass the continuing resolution and hopefully get to a budget, the numbers that we have going into 18 are going to support some healthy additions to ship maintenance. At all times, we're going to look at the business opportunities available, the best deal for the American taxpayer. If you look at the Western Pacific and you look at how we go about repairing, we do have Japan, we do have robust dockside abilities in Guam, we have Hawaii, and then we move to the West Coast for big deep dive maintenance availabilities. We will, on an ongoing basis, look for any and all capabilities as we go forward because we are going to be using them if, in fact, we receive the funding to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I appreciate your comments during this hearing and your leadership in ensuring adequate ship repair capabilities, especially in the Pacific, necessary to maintain the fleet and keep it forward deployed. I also appreciate our meeting last week, as you mentioned, and your commitment to working with me as you review options for ship repair in the Western Pacific that makes strategic and operational sense. I hope that we can continue our positive dialogue and work on a solution that supports American jobs and our readiness in the region. And I have a second question for you also, Mr. Secretary. Or no, this one is for Admiral Richardson. It is my understanding that forward deployed naval forces had critical operational demands that took the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain away from dedicated maintenance, training, and certification periods. Now, can you please describe steps that the Navy has taken to ensure that this is not continuing to occur with the remaining FDNF ships? In other words, how are we ensuring FDNF ships receive the necessary maintenance and training to set their crews up for success?
Yes, ma'am. The establishment of that fourth generation model in Japan, the fact that we are doing rigorous scheduling, not only for maintenance, but also to schedule training and certification events enforced by the fleet commander before they are assigned to missions. That is essentially our side, the supply side of the supply-demand tension. And so that adhering to that in a rigorous way is really the way that we guarantee that. And then as we look through the command and control structure in a comprehensive way with both the CR and the strategic review, establishing sort of an advocate for training and certification out there will be part of that.
And Admiral, you can assure that this is occurring right as we speak.
It is. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Congressman Badallo. And myself, having toured the Guam Naval Shipyard, I share your appreciation of the assets there. We now proceed to Chairman Rob Whitman of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks again for joining us today. I think you will agree with me in that we need to make sure that our junior surface Navy officers need time to excel in their trades. Today, though, in the Navy, if you look at our surface warfare officers, we see a path for them to be generalists, not one that allows them to be specialists, allows them to really get down into that specific area of skill that they need across all these different areas of ship operations that have become increasingly more complex. We see the aviation community that looks into creating those specialists. We see foreign navies doing the same thing, where in this increasingly complex and technologically challenging environment, specialties are things that are encouraged. Is it time for the Navy to adopt best practices for deck and engineering specialists development within our junior officer corps within the Navy?
Sir, as you can appreciate, that model, which is largely used by the Royal Navy, is always on the table and being assessed and considered. I look forward to having a more robust conversation with you about some of these. It's that the gives and takes are complicated. But in terms of the approach that the U.S. Navy has taken throughout its history, we've seen that, to your point, providing adequate time to learn the trade of being the officer of the deck and driving a U.S. warship, it requires time and rigor in that training cycle. And there is also value to understanding the engineering department and the rest of the ship as well. Sure. And so there's always a balance there. I look forward to discussing that with you more.
Great, and that's a great lead into the next question, and that is, as our junior officers come to the fleet, as that new ensign comes to the fleet, and they're faced with standing that watch, with being the junior officer on the deck, and increasingly more complex responsibilities there, the question always becomes, when they come to the fleet, what experience do they come with? Do they have time at sea experience? I know my son, who's a merchant mariner, has spent years and years and years, thousands of hours of sea time and many, many courses to actually get a certification so that he can captain a ship at sea. The question then becomes, should we have the same component for those young ensigns that are put on board a gray hull in the experience that they have? Should they not maybe spend a year at sea? I understand you can't go there immediately, but should they not maybe spend a year at sea and get their third mate's license so that when they get to the fleet, they are extraordinarily well versed and experienced with that?
Yes, sir. Again, I think we have to really spent a long time on problem definition with respect to this career path. As you can appreciate, driving to destroy a complex U.S. Navy warship is much more complicated than driving a merchant ship. But again, I think we're in violent agreement that training and career path needs some adjustment, some rugged enhancements.
Sure.
Those have all been part of the recommendations in the comprehensive review, and the strategic review is in agreement with that.
Yeah.
And so I think that moving through those recommendations as proposed right now will get at your concerns, which I share.
Very good. One other additional element, too, as we look at forward deployed naval forces, and we look at the Navy's directive to say those ships should return back stateside every 7 to 10 years for the deep dive maintenance to make sure that their material readiness is where it needs to be. Because these are the ships, tip of the spear, they get pushed the hardest. They're out there, really on point constantly. Do you believe that a situation like we had with McCain, where it's been there for 20 years without coming back stateside? And listen, I understand the things that go on at Yokosuka, but there's a limited capability in really the deep dive maintenance that's being done there. Do you think that the maintenance cycles of FD&F ships coming back stateside should be looked at and getting back to a 7 to 10 year cycle?
Sir, we already did that. Even before these incidents, we'd already made the decision to return to that cycle. And so I can give you the specific schedule of those FD&F ships that will be returning stateside, and that rotation. It's a bit classified, but I'll give it to you in the appropriate setting. So we've already decided that trying to do all the maintenance in forward deployed naval forces in Yokosuka or Sasebo, it's not a long-term solution, so we'll be bringing those ships back. Our goal is to get to an 8-year cycle.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you, Chairman Whitman. We now proceed to Ranking Member Joe Courtney of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, for the benefit of the record,
Joe, get him to turn his microphone on.
what the problem is with the current command and control structure, which both of the reports identified as not optimal. Did you hear that?
I believe I did.
Okay. Which did not hear is optimal and contributed to the readiness issues in the 7th Fleet. Why are you seeking to change that structure, and why do you need Congress's help?
Congressman, we just had our first, I call it a solarium, where we brought together both our 4 stars, some 3 stars, some graybeards, and sit down and looked at the wiring diagram for command and control in the Navy, specifically the Pacific Fleet and the European theater. We had 2 goals in mind in this first meeting: was to basically assess what we had, guide ourselves by our goal should be that the commander of a ship should have a clear line to know what he or she is reporting to and whom she or he is reporting to. We should also have a clear line of sight from command on down as to where responsibilities lie. When we looked at the chart, we have not come to final conclusions yet, but we are in an iterative process, which we'll have our first step forthcoming soon. We wanted to clean up exactly what you were talking about, which is the ability for us to act in the most efficient manner possible with the most direct lines of communication.
And why do you need Congress to help you with that?
Well, we have, in the case of the Pacific Fleet, we have an issue that I believe is going to be ameliorated if, in fact, we do away with what used to be known as the Inouye Amendment. And again, we have a clearer, direct command and control as to what the line of sight is for responsibility and efficiency.
Thank you. And again, just for the, to be clear, that amendment is not really, well, that amendment actually intrudes by Congress in terms of how the command and control structure is designed. If that amendment was removed, we actually step back. Congress steps back from this issue and really allows the Navy to then move forward with a more optimal arrangement, which I think, again, both reports really identify that as a way to move forward and to help untangle the conflicts. Is that correct?
We are in agreement, yes.
And Admiral, would you agree with that?
Sir, I would. To me, it's all about standards, and the way that this amendment is structured, it allows really 2 standards to emerge, and we need to have one single standard of excellence for our Navy for these matters.
Great, thank you. Admiral, the Government Accountability Office reviewed the certifications for the ships involved in the 2017 mishaps and found that many had expired and remained expired for months or years. The McCain had 7 of 22 certifications expired, some for more than 2 years. The Fitzgerald had 15 of 22 certifications expired, including a basic seamanship certification, which had been expired for nearly a year. Admiral, what's your plan to bring these ships back into compliance with their basic certification requirements? And I know that you canceled all existing risk mitigation plans and required ships to resubmit more comprehensive plans at a higher command than before. What is the status of developing and improving these new plans, and how are the forward deployed ships treating these risks differently than before?
Well, sir, the immediate actions are complete, which was to re-baseline all ships except for those in maintenance, deep maintenance in Yokosuka. And so those ready-for-sea assessments have been done on all cruisers and destroyers in the forward deployed naval forces in Japan. That includes the certification for every ship that's underway assigned to a mission to be certified to do those missions, and that's being done at the 7th Fleet Command level. And then there is sort of the longer-term plan to go through, sort of the longer, more detailed holistic certifications for each of these ships, and that's being done on a priority basis as well.
So what we had before was a device, a risk mitigation plan, which really sort of lost its meaning because of, again, just the repeated. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. This is the exact definition of normalization of deviance. Is that what started from a risk mitigation? Hey, we know you can't get this done, but here's the mitigating measures we'll take. We'll maybe put this expertise on board, and we'll reschedule that. That devolved down to really almost a rubber stamp. That's clearly articulated in Admiral Davidson's comprehensive review. And so part of this matter that we've talked about with respect to the Inouye Amendment is having that advocate for force generation and the training and certification standards that can really, whose sole function is to maintain those standards. That installs a fire break, if you will, from allowing this degradation to happen again.
And thank you, Congressman Courtney. We now proceed to Congressman Duncan Hunter of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to tie in with what Chairman Whitman's kind of line of questioning was, and it's specific because in San Diego we had the LCS there in the beginning, and I went, I don't know, it's like six years ago or so. I went to the LCS simulator, if you will, right there by 32nd Street, and it's the bridge of an LCS, and it's a virtual environment. You can walk around on it. You can see all the way around. I think it moves even. The water looks like it moves. It's a fairly realistic setup, and it's cheap because it's not a real boat that's underway. I've also seen the LCS courseware where it's game-based learning. I think it's immersive virtual ship environment learning as well. I think they use it for like the engine plants on one of the LCSs. I don't remember which one, but it works. It works. It's game-based learning. It's new. All the kids do it. They know how to play an Xbox. They know how to do this. So specifically then, in light of the value of the LCS training program, how do you plan on leveraging that type of thing where you don't have to go out for a year at sea? You can spend three weeks on the bridge of a ship like the one you're going to take over or you're going to be on the deck of. And when there were a couple of things, that's my first question, how you plan to leverage that. Admiral Richardson stated, multiple bridge watch standards like the basic level of knowledge on the steering control system, in particular the transfer of steering and thrust control, et cetera. And with the USS McCain, several sailors, I quote again, several sailors on watch during the collision with the control over steering were temporarily assigned from USS Antietam. So they could have done a game-based learning scenario on the ship before they transferred to the new ship and been at least familiar with what they were going to do on the ship, and easily, because it's in the cloud or it's on a DVD. So that's my question. I'll stop there and let you answer. Thank you.
Sir, if I could just read it back to you, is the value of simulators in terms of training and certifying our sailors. I couldn't agree with you more that particularly now with the technology, the degree of realism, the fidelity of those simulators is very, very high. It can't take you all the way, as you know from your service, but it can take you a lot further than it used to. And so with respect to the LCS, which is designed to have sort of a blue-gold crew type of an arrangement, there's going to be one crew on the ship all the time, and 1 crew in the trainers and simulators. And so we need to make those as realistic as possible, as prototypic to the complexity of the assignment. So we're all in on that. As the comprehensive review states, we need to sort of spread that philosophy around so that we can move those simulators and stand them up in places like Yokosuka, Japan, like Sasebo, so that we've got that level of training capacity and capability there. And it's much more than just the realistic environment. It also allows you to measure your performance throughout the game, right? And so it's more than just kids playing games. These are the science behind these things in terms of accelerating learning has really been stunning in the last 10 years. We're leveraging all of that, not only in the corrective actions for these incidents, but in the training philosophy for the Navy, which falls under the title of Ready Relevant Learning.
Congressman, I just might add, when it comes to how we're going to address training, AI is now just beginning to tip our scales. If we look at specifically what you're talking about with simulators, et cetera, they have the ability, and we're exploring the application of artificial intelligence, which actually would work with the individual people to find weaknesses and actually strengthen the areas of weakness. You might turn around and ask, what are we looking for going forward? I'm going to pre-answer a question because it fits right here in the wheelhouse. Between the SRR and the CR, we're probably looking for $800 million over the fit-up, and it's primarily in the area of schools, the simulators, bridge uniformity, along those lines. But it's not a tremendous amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but it has great leverage.
Thank you both. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman Hunter. We now proceed to Congressman Salud Carbajal of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, for being here today. I am concerned about the frequency and number of expired warfare certifications in the fleet. In instances where a ship is required for a mission but lacks the certification for the primary mission, what mitigations actions will the Navy take to include globally sourcing ships? Do other warfare areas, for example, aviation or submarines, allow their platforms to deploy following a depot-level repair without certifying qualifications and ensuring a minimum level of safe-to-train criteria? What steps will the Navy take to ensure basic and advanced training are satisfied before they are sourced to other defense missions?
Sir, I'll take a first stab at that question, which is really goes back to this fourth generation model and the rigor that needs to be applied to the training and certification elements of the fourth generation schedule. And so typically when a ship or an aircraft or any Navy asset, any Navy platform comes out of a deep maintenance period, there is a workup period where you work up the crew and then you take them from basic through intermediate and advanced. That's certainly a very formal process for ships stationed in the continental United States, and they get formally certified before they deploy. And then with respect to other forward deployed naval forces, both in Bahrain in the Middle East and also in Rota, Spain, those models have been adhered to, and we don't see these lapse certifications in those forward deployed places as we did in Japan. And so it really is a matter of rigor. The new 7th Fleet commander is on that. We're looking at command and control structures to buttress that approach. And that's all wrapped into the comprehensive plan going forward. In the immediate time, we've taken action to ensure that every ship that's underway right now is certified for the missions it's conducting.
Thank you. Secretary? Nothing to add? Well, let me ask you a second question. Under the current command and control construct for the Navy surface forces in the Pacific, there appears to be an inherent conflict with having a single command responsible for both sourcing operational requirements and ensuring the proper manning, training, equipment of the fleet. What steps is the Navy taking to address the conflict, and how can Congress help?
Sir, as we address the command and control, the comprehensive review and the strategic review are in firm agreement that there needs to be a separation to a degree, as good a degree as possible, between those responsible for training and certifying forces to be ready, and then those who are responsible for employing those ready forces to meet combatant commander requests, demands. And so that separation to a single standard of excellence is a major goal for both of the reviews, and will certainly be one of the major achievements going forward. With respect to any assistance from the Congress, this in-a-way amendment, as it was called, is just one, I would say, artificial seam that inhibits us from establishing that single standard.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Congressman Carbajal. We now proceed to Congressman Bradley Byrne of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good to see you. I heard what you said loud and clear about continuing resolutions. And you need to know that there are many of us on this committee and many of us off the committee who've been communicating very directly and very clearly to the leadership of the Congress that the use of continuing resolutions to fund the government, and particularly the use of continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, has got to stop. We hear you, and you have many advocates in this room. Last week at the Surface Navy Association Symposium, Vice Admiral Rowden said the way to avoid collisions like the Fitzgerald and McCain is to give our crews more time to train and maintain. He offered two options on how to get there: more ships or fewer obligations. I think we can all agree that the current threat environment is not going to lead to fewer obligations. So that means more ships. The Navy's requirement, and now the statutory requirement adopted by Congress and signed by the President, is a 355-ship fleet. Now, in order for us to help you, we need to know what the plan is. We haven't received a new 30-year shipbuilding plan under this administration. Can we expect this plan to be delivered with the President's budget next month?
Yes, you can,
Good.
Congressman.
The FY18 NDAA authorized 13 ships, which was 5 more than the President's budget requested, in large part to ensure we are taking advantage of hot production lines across the industrial base to keep acquisition efficient and affordable. Does the Navy recognize that without careful planning, losses in our industrial base make achieving a 355-ship Navy nearly impossible?
Congressman, we are very much aware of this, and I'm more than happy to share with you and your fellow members the analysis that we've just come through, and we're putting a dot on it as we speak. There is, as we call it, 3 projections. We can go along on a keep everything warm line, which does not get us to 355 within an acceptable period of time. We can do a normalized curve, which brings it in a little closer, or a very aggressive curve. The balancing act that we have to do is to feed our demand need, and also, to be very frank with you, care for the industrial base, because one of the things we're suffering right now is the last boom and bust, because we have a number of hulls that are coming up in a short period of time for decommissioning. And if we can smooth that curve, that would be an excellent solution for both the industrial base and for us. That is all with one caveat. If, in fact, we need ships for whatever reason at an expedited rate, we're going to have to go there.
Sir, if I could add on to that.
Yes, sir.
When we bring you this plan, it will come with some historical perspective, really sort of going back to 1955 and tracking our way forward. And it will show you the absolutely devastating effect of the peace dividend, if you will, on our industrial base, where more than a dozen shipyards really shuttered down, and leaves us with an industrial base that's has far less capacity now. So we need to really protect that treasure with everything we can.
Well, I think both of you know this, but when we stood up the shipyard in Mobile, I was the chancellor of post-secondary education for the state, and we had the entity under my direction that actually had to create the workforce for the shipyard in Mobile. And we had the luxury of time, a whole lot of time, and we had a recession where we had a lot of people laid off. We have exactly the opposite situation right now. We do not have the luxury of time. We have a very active economy where people with those sorts of skills, if we lay them off, they can go anywhere and get a job, and it's very hard both to train the people that you need to replace them, and the people you train will not have the experience that the people they're replacing had, which means you're going to have a less efficient production schedule, and the ship's going to cost more, which we all don't want the ships to cost more. So I just plead with you, and I know you hear me because I've said this to you so many times, please work with us on this. I just want you to know that as you work to implement the priorities of the Trump administration, we expect a larger investment in shipbuilding to relieve the stress on our current fleet, which we know has contributed to some of these issues. We in Congress are your willing partners, and we want to help in growing the fleet. However, we can't do that unless we have a signal from you on what you need and understand your roadmap to get there. So I understand the roadmap is forthcoming. I look forward to having some time with you so I can understand what I can do and what we can do together to grow the fleet. And I yield back.
Thank you, Councilman Byrne. We now proceed to Councilwoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida.
Secretary Spencer, Admiral Richardson, thank you for your testimony here today. First, I want to associate myself with the comments of some of my colleagues that we must do all that we can to ensure that the tragic accidents that the tragic and avoidable surface fleet incidents that we experienced this year never happen again. And specifically, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks by Rep. Bradley regarding the continuing resolutions. I have heard you and your colleagues loud and clear about the deleterious effect of CRs on the Navy's ability to ensure readiness. And I hope you know that we'll continue to advocate to ensure that you have a predictable funding stream for our military so that you can make the investments that are needed to ensure readiness and the safety of our sailors. Just by way of introduction, my district is in Central Florida, and it's home to Team Orlando, which is a vibrant modeling, simulation, and training community centered around the Navy's NOC TSD. I've had the opportunity to see demonstrations of the same virtual game-based training systems for specific workstation requirements that Mr. Hunter had described. There are several companies located in my district in Orlando that offer innovative training solutions like this, and I'm just very impressed by the technology. As Mr. Hunter had said, these immersive virtual training systems can either be deployed in schoolhouses or be operated on a sailor's laptop or another device. So I wanted to ask you, do you see value in virtual training technologies that can help ensure that sailors in operational environments are maintaining their qualifications and routinely assessed while deployed? And also, to follow up, and another question on that is, what is the Navy doing urgently in 2018 to improve training deficiencies in navigation, emergency procedures, and collision avoidance in highly trafficked areas?
I'll take the first part of your question, Congresswoman. As far as it comes to virtual reality training and the technological advances that are available to us, we are looking at every single possible avenue. Having just signed out travel authority last quarter for close to 500 members of the Navy to go down to Orlando and participate in that event down there, I think that shows our level of commitment to the area. In my initial testimony in confirmation, I will reiterate again that technology is going to be our force multiplier in every single aspect of how we do business, and training is one that we will benefit from.
Great, thank you.
Ma'am, I'll pile in on part two of your question. With respect to just immediate actions to address the concerns you had regarding operation in heavily trafficked areas, we've revised the formality of the procedures for ships approaching within 2 nautical miles to preserve decision-making time for the commanding officers to assess that heavily trafficked area. We've changed the reporting criteria regarding propulsion, navigation, and steering types of systems so that we have a more firm control over and a reassurance that those systems operate properly. That also includes damage control systems, and there's a whole list that I could go down of things, measures that we've taken. Automatic identification system, the rules governing when to transmit on that so you are visible to other ships in the area have changed for our surface ships operating in those areas, and we're going to integrate that AIS system more seamlessly into the rest of the gear that we use to establish situational awareness in those types of situations. So a whole host of measures have already been taken.
And specifically, have you expedited any training, additional training, or other ways in which to make the sailors more prepared?
To date, because it has been such a short time, a lot of that has been sort of on board the ship. So we've just sort of mandated, and the CEOs didn't really need to be told, right? They knew what to get after. In the longer term, as we look to expand some of these types of technologies and enhance them more into the fleet concentration areas around the world, we're certainly going to be going to these types of simulation and performance measuring types of systems to get us up to speed as fast as possible.
Thank you, and I yield back.
And thank you, Congresswoman Murphy. We now proceed to Congressman Dr. Ralph Abraham of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for being here. And I appreciate the words of the authority and responsibility, because we all know that certainly in the military or business, you can designate authority but never responsibility. So I appreciate you gentlemen being here. And Mr. Secretary, the analogy to the Mayo Clinic with the lead surgeon, I think is a good comparison as to how things go. We understand certainly in hazard mitigation and risk management that there is an error chain usually if you have an incident, a mishap, or an accident. And if any link of that chain is broken, then that error or that accident does not happen. We all are familiar with the Swiss cheese model with the holes lining up, so to speak. And unfortunately, in these incidences that we're here to talk about, the holes did align, and we understand. So I assume and I hope that the culture of the Navy, Admiral, is that if any member of that crew sees something and he or she says, knock it off, or some phraseology, that everybody takes a step back and reevaluates where they are.
Sir, absolutely. And so you're very familiar with the investigations and the literature on these types of major events. They are the accumulation of a lot of small errors that just sort of line up in a very unpredictable way, whether that be Deepwater Horizon, Challenger, an operating room. And so that's exactly the philosophy that we're taking.
And I'll associate my comment with my good friend Bradley over here as far as the funding. We certainly on HASC, but I can say most, if not all, members of Congress understand the severe shortage that you're faced with. And when we're told and we understand that in last year, 2017, that we had almost 4 times the number of training accidents as we did have deaths in combat, there's something wrong there. And we understand that does go back to certification, training, and that type of issue. So I just want to make a statement that, again, I appreciate your forthrightness of coming forward, giving us direct answers to direct questions, and we certainly understand what the continuing CRs does to the train or therefore lack of training in your wheelhouse. So thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And thank you very much, Dr. Abraham. We now proceed to Congressman Ro Khanna of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, Admiral Richardson, thank you for your service. My question concerns the Aegis system, and I wanted your assessment of how effective that currently is in the boost phase of an intercontinental ballistic missile in intercepting that, and how much assurance the American public could have in that technology currently.
Well, first, let me say foremost that the Aegis combat system is highly effective in the ballistic missile defense role. And so we have tuned it for that role. We continue to improve it for that role, not only in the combat system, but also the interceptors. And so that's a program, a capability that's on a path of continuous improvement. You asked specifically about the boost phase. Well, I'll tell you, just from a geometry standpoint, I've got to say that that is a very difficult part of the kill chain, if you will, to get after. The missile that you're trying to hit does not spend a lot of time in the boost phase. Depending upon where it's launched, just achieving the geometry to get any type of an interceptor to intercept that missile during its boost phase is difficult. And so it takes a very sophisticated combination of sensors to get it, instantaneously, and then a highly capable vehicle to intercept it. So we're working towards that capability, and the Aegis system will naturally be a big part of that.
So right now, is there any capability of getting a missile that's launched at any phase other than the ground interceptors, or right now there's with the Aegis system?
Absolutely. Throughout, and particularly sort of in the terminal phase is where exo-atmospheric phase is where those do best. If we've got the opportunity, there's nothing that really precludes us from a system standpoint of getting the boost phase. It's just physics. It's just time and distance you gotta be very, very close and very, very fast to catch it in that phase.
Would you then, in Congress, if we were prioritizing funding more of the ground interceptors with the hope of preventing an intercontinental ballistic missile that was about to hit, or if we were saying let's fund more the development of the Aegis system to prevent an intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit the United States, what would you recommend, and how difficult would it be to have a system that would have a very high probability of success?
Well, again, the probability of success for intercept is pretty high, and in terms of the approach to missile defense, it really is a comprehensive approach that you want to take without singling in on any specific capability. So I'm reluctant to choose between one system or another. They're all appropriate in different applications.
We make tough choices. You make tough choices all the time. I mean, in terms of if you had resources, how would you allocate them or prioritize them?
I think that the program that's put forward is the best balance and assessment of the comprehensive approach.
Thank you. Any further? Thank you. Go back.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Connor. We now proceed to Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you both for your service and for being with us today. You said something very interesting that I think was not in your written testimony, but was in your oral testimony about how the lack of adequate funding has affected the Navy, and something about a scale of 1 to 10. If you wouldn't mind sort of repeating that, because I actually think it's a particularly important point for us to hear.
Sir, I'd be happy to repeat that. I think I really talked about, let me see, the toxic and corrosive effect of 9 years of continuing resolutions and the Budget Control Act. And I wanted to highlight that there's plenty of work that we are responsible for, and we're going to get after that. But the absence of stable and adequate funding for defense makes everything that we're doing to correct this system harder, much harder. And on a scale of 1 to 10, the importance of stable and adequate funding scores an 11.
That's a really critical point. I salute you for bringing that to light, and hope we can echo that, particularly in the context of the negotiation we're having right now. And I would say, Mr. Secretary, you referenced sort of a solarium process underway, which of course is a model for a competitive review of strategy, but we sort of already legislated that review through 3 outside assessments of what the future fleet needs to look like. I'm heartened to hear that we're going to get the 30-year shipbuilding plan soon. So I do think we need sort of a rethink of our communications strategy and start from the beginning, making that strategy first case to the American people for why Seapower is so critical to our national security in the first place. Because it strikes me as someone who's only been here for a year that we keep making the same case, and for whatever reason, it's not working. So I just would ask you, and maybe this is a dumb question, Mr. Secretary, what's kind of your elevator pitch to the American people? Describe to me, if you will, what the purpose of the Navy is today and in the near future.
Well, the purpose of the Navy, Congressman, is it is your forward deployed force, your primary forward deployed force, the most limber and flexible force that you have for a multitude of things, but primarily which comes to the top issues would be keeping the arteries of commerce open on the open seas, the presence factor of American power around the globe, keeping peace through presence, and then when needed, the ability to provide the kinetic actions that we need to suppress and or conquer our foes.
I appreciate it.
And through that, you need platforms, whether on the sea, under the sea, or in the air, and that's where Navy has all 3.
And can you both give me a sense of how do you think about conveying that purpose to the American public, to the fleet, to our allies, and our potential adversaries? And is that messaging coordinated? It is aligned? Who's responsible? What's the process for strategic communications, if you will?
Well, I think the CNO and I are aligned in this. I flash back to when I was going through confirmation, and CNO, your strategy for naval forces going forward did highlight it. It is out there in the public. Obviously, what we're hearing, Congressman, is we have to do it in a better manner. But it's a lockstep message, which I just presented to you with the top 3 points.
Yeah.
Sir, if I could just add, President's just released his national security strategy. The national defense strategy is imminent. And right on the heels of that will be the military strategy and a maritime strategy. And so with this issuance of strategic documents and, the sort of tiering of those, I would anticipate a vigorous strategic communications program going forward as we put together and release the new maritime strategy.
That's great to hear. And I know there's been some controversy about sort of the defense guidance that went out saying, it's err on the side of silence. I just would personally like to say I actually think that's a mistake in this case. I understand that loose lips can sink ships, but non-existent strategic communications can sink entire navies. And we need to do a better job of making that case to the American people. And it's a partnership between us and between you, but you have the benefit of having the trust of the American people and a high approval rating that at times Congress does not. So we could really use your help in that regard.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
So I appreciate your help there, and you're pushing us in this regard, and we'll go as far as we can, up to the point where the information we're providing provides information that the enemy can use against us. I mean, that's the only point that we'll just have to stop.
Totally understand that. I have 16 seconds. If I could quickly ask Secretary Spencer, how do you exercise oversight of the Navy and Marine Corps in their planning, programming, and budgeting execution activities? In other words, how do you ensure that the budgets of the Navy and Marine Corps are a reflection of sort of an integrated vision of American sea power?
That is one of my sole jobs with Title X when it comes to the budgeting plan. What we look for going forward in this last cycle, which was my first cycle, was the overlaying needs, overlaying plan, and then overlaying strategy and funding to that strategy, which is what we have done this last time around.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen, and Secretary, I'd like to thank your wife as well for signing up for this assignment. So.
And thank you, Congressman Gallagher, particularly with your combat background and experience. We appreciate your insight. Congressman Don McEachin of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and Admiral, thank you both for being here. We've already spoken a little bit today about the fact that it's now our national policy to have not fewer than 355 battle force ships. Am I correct in assuming that if we make that progress, that would at least partially relieve the pressures that we've discussed here today? I'm under the assumption that being able to distribute the same commitments across a larger fleet would help. Am I under the right assumption?
That's absolutely correct, sir.
All right. Pending the addition of the actual new ships to the Navy, are there steps that the Congress can take, recognizing the resource constraints under which we operate and the need to continue investing in many priorities aside from defense, that would demonstrate the seriousness of our commitment to 355 ships in such a way that pressures were relieved on the front end? In other words, can we make things easier by giving you greater certainty that help is on the way?
Most definitely, Congressman. If we look at shipbuilding in particular, the conversations that we have with the industrial base, we are looking to make sure they're the most competitive, lowest cost provider with highest quality in the quickest manner possible. We turn around and ask them, where are the capital investments that you're making in your yards to make you competitive and to provide a product in the parameters that I just presented to you? And they turn around and say, well, you give me the signal that there's a consistency to fund 3, 4, 5, 7 ships, I will make that commensurate investment. And that's where, when I talk about the fact that we have to be partnership with industry, that is exactly what they're looking for, and that is exactly how you could help us, is to provide us the ability to send that signal, or you send it directly, that yes, this is where we want to go and this is what our goal will be.
Sir, if I could add to that.
Please.
In terms of that assurance, right now as we speak, we have about 400,000 sailors and 180,000 Navy civilians looking at their watch, wondering if the government's going to shut down or they're going to get paid. Right. So,
And we do understand that. I thank you both, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman McEachin. We now proceed to Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, to both the Secretary as well as the CNO. I do want to say something and make it very clear for the record. The Senator Inoue was not one of us, normal kind of person. He is, of course, the recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest award that can be presented in gratitude to anyone who wears the uniforms that you do. In addition, he's a recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He, like me, we represent the state of Hawaii, and of course we are home to the Pacific Command. And as you know, their AOR is almost 55% of the Earth's surface. I'm a strong advocate, and I say this to the people in the Army, to their chagrin, that the Pacific is an air and sea power, but more accurately, a sea power. And therefore, I am very concerned when we sit here and we start to say, well, you know, maybe we need, and I don't disagree with a standard of excellence, a single standard of excellence. However, I would like to impress upon you that the Pacific is different. Where these accidents occurred, especially in the McCain, is in a very busy area, because when we were briefed earlier, what we are faced with is a lot of commercial traffic as well. It's not like during World War II when it was just basically the military ships going back and forth. It is the busiest commercial trade zones in the world. Having said that, Admiral Richardson, in your testimony, you said looking back to 2017 was a year of triumph and tragedy for our Navy. We consistently forward deployed more than 60,000 sailors and 95 ships and submarines around the globe. So does that mean we only had 95 of our 280 some odd ships, a very far cry from the 355 or President Obama's 318? Is that what you're saying in that statement? We only had 95 deployed?
Consistently at any one day, we had 95 deployed. So that's about more than a third of your battle force. And so it goes back to this training and certification cycle that we're on. Those are ships that are on mission, and the others are in maintenance and training, getting ready to go on mission. And so that's sort of the ratios that you deal with when you're talking about maintaining a force forward deployed.
So the Secretary had a statement that was very interesting, that the Strategic Readiness Review Team's assessment determined that today's readiness deficiencies, and I assume this also talks about Fitzgerald, McCain, and the other two that resulted with no physical injury to our benefit, are not traceable to any single policy or leadership decision, but rather the cumulative effect of well-meaning decisions that were designed to achieve short-term operational goals. I read in one of these reports that the problem was that actually those of you in the Pentagon would make decisions that we have to take action, and you would basically send it down to the chain of command, and whether they were adequate or not. The problem with maybe even the Pacific Fleet or PACOM and all of our sailors is that they serve, and they probably were under adverse circumstances to do that. Was that a correct statement, Mr. Secretary?
The Navy Marine Corps team, much like our other sister services, are organizations that are biased for action, and that's what you want from uniformed people. What we have to find is that fine balance between when the alarm goes off in the barn, running out the door and making sure that you are prepared to do the mission you're doing.
And I'm going to be running out of time, but I do wish that you would consider one thing. I believe the Pacific is different than the European theater. It is different. And the reason why I feel that Senator probably put in what you're calling the Inoue Amendment is to ensure that the difference of that which is the Pacific would become foremost in everyone's mind. I also would like you to also take more responsibility that the McCain and Fitzgerald were basically 20 years old, and the training that goes on those ships and the fact that they're in Yokosuka and not being maintained like everything else is really a function of, I think, higher up decisions than what you are concerned with. So I think this amendment that you are taking issue with probably is a good way to protect the people that serve in the PACOM AOR. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
And thank you, Congresswoman Hanabusa. We now proceed to Congressman Darrell Norcross of New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman and Chairmans, for holding this hearing, and certainly the ranking members. This is the last of many hearings we've held on the tragedies that you've talked about and we've heard about today. Secretary and Admiral, good to see you again. When we look at what had occurred after the first loss of life and then a second accident with a loss of life, I have to say how impressed we were after the second one, the reaction we finally were getting to try to address some core issues. And it's a challenge, there's no question about that. And back on November, the Fleet Comprehensive Review made 58 recommendations. And then after that, December 13th was the Readiness Review that had with it 6 chapters and 23 recommendations. And I just want to read to you out of the December 13th Readiness Review that talked about the very first recommendation on there: condition congressional and executive branch leaders to accept that a higher cost and time to achieve established readiness standards will mean less presence worldwide. It appears, reading that somehow you're making a choice between safety and lives and readiness. And I know you would never suggest that you understand that everybody on your command is a valuable source for not only our country, but the world. But to read that, it seems like you have to make a choice. Either we're going to be ready or we're putting people at risk to lose their lives. The recommendations, the vast majority of them, I agree with. But I just want to give you a chance to address the very first recommendation that somehow we can choose safety or readiness. And I know you don't mean that. Would you explain that?
Certainly, Congressman. What it does is brings up in the conversation that it is a mathematical game. You cannot expand what you don't have. And we have to make sure everyone is attuned to that. And that is our responsibility, the CNO and I, to make sure that you all on the funding side understand what we are looking at this model. That's what that recommendation was to do, to get the conversation started.
Just because, are you suggesting we don't understand that?
No, I'm not suggesting you don't understand it. I'm suggesting that the discussion has to be made and has to be understood.
You make those decisions every day, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Sir, as I interpret that, if I could just pile on to what the Secretary is saying, I think as I read that, it really strengthens the argument that our responsibility is to be both safe and ready before we go out and get assigned to a mission. And so it's not a tension between safety and readiness as I see it. We need to cover down on those two fundamental obligations before we send that ship forward and put it into harm's way.
You need both. There's
Yes,
no
sir.
question about
Exactly
it.
right. Yes,
So it's our obligation along with yours to make sure that you have the tools you need at the appropriate time.
It's a shared thing. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Norcross. We now proceed to Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, and Admiral Richardson. Thank you for being here for your testimony. I'd like to just continue on the issue of training and readiness. I'd like to know if and how the Navy is looking towards the expertise and training regimen of the professional mariner community in order to adopt best practices and improve upon navigation and seamanship and ship handling skills. For example, in the United States Maritime Resource Center in my state of Rhode Island delivers professional training and continuous assessment of these proficiencies, having provided all the initial core nautical science and professional maritime training for the NOAA Corps, for example. So have you considered utilizing in-depth training and assessment from the professional mariner community to fill any competency gaps that you might be facing right now?
Sir, we have a pretty good dialogue with that community, and dependent upon capacity and really technology, there were times where we were using those simulators quite a bit. Now, if you go just up the road to Newport, you know, we'll find some pretty state-of-the-art trainers that better simulate some of the ships that we're training our officers and sailors to drive. But in terms of standards and approaches, I would say it's a vigorous dialogue. But what I like to do is just make sure that I'm right, you know, and I'm current, and I'll get back to you, sir.
Okay, good enough. Thank you. So I also understand the Navy plans to continue to conduct in-service material inspections every 6 years as opposed to every 3, potentially delaying necessary maintenance. So, you know, I think this is one of those areas where we sung this song before, and the Navy's current collision record, unfortunately, is partly the result of choices to lessen shoreside training that were made over a decade ago. And while I support reducing burdensome requirements, I do worry that loosening these inspection standards may set us up for increased maintenance problems in the future. So is this a concern for the Navy, and how do you intend to mitigate this potential risk?
So you brought up the matter of inspections, and it's an absolute fundamental part of the way going forward. We want to make sure that we are inspecting at the proper frequency and that those inspections are useful to the crew, particularly the commanding officer, so that he or she can make the adjustments and continue to improve their crew. The comprehensive review found that there was something on the order of almost 300 inspections in a typical training cycle, many of which never spoke to the commanding officer, and it's hard, you know, to be honest, to even keep track of those. You mentioned in-serve. That's one of the critical ones for material readiness. I take those in-serve briefs myself, as does the Secretary. We provide an in-serve report to Congress. We're moving back to 3-year periodicity, where we have you know, a full-on detailed in-serve, and then 3 years later we'll have sort of a lighter version of that in-serve that'll come back and validate, and then have a heavy one again. And so also looking at what do those in-serves actually inspect in terms of articulating the material readiness to conduct combat operations. You know, not all deficiencies are created equal when it comes to that. And so we are very interested and moving forward to make those in-service inspections, both at the proper periodicity and looking at the proper things.
Okay. And another topic, in order to match supply and demand, as noted in your strategic readiness review, how do you intend to balance reestablishing a culture of safety to support sustainable operations and the long-term goal of persistent readiness and the constant need to fill increased operational requirements? Will you change your processes as to how you assess the readiness of ships and sailors?
What we have in place, Congressman, as you've heard us say before, the systems are in place. We've had a deviation from the norm. And the biggest lever that we have now is to have the conversations to bring us back towards norm. I believe, and I'll defer to the CNO, that we have a pretty good system in place right now that has adjudication, the ability to bring supply and demand to conversation and an adjudication process. But again, what we want to make sure is everyone is realizing what the true math is with the numbers.
Okay. Well, thank you both for what you're doing. We'll continue to be on top of this, something I'm going to follow closely. I know my colleagues and I will all do that. But thank you for your service and for being here today. Look forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Langevin. We now conclude with Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your indulgence, the committee's indulgence, in allowing me to be here today. Thank you very much, Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, for your service and for being here. And I don't have a question. I've appreciated very much the chance to sit in, to understand where things stand, where you're going. But I also want to echo what you've heard a number of times here today, and that is that we take very seriously. It's not just a situation, as you know, where we are in a holding pattern because of the CRs, but there are many of us, particularly on armed services, but broadly, who are consistently making the point that we are causing damage, that every time we vote for another continuing resolution, we are doing damage. One more day is more damage, and you've made that point very eloquently. We're in a situation where we have to make sure that the members of Congress recognize and understand that our constitutional obligation is not being fulfilled so long as we don't provide that kind of stable and sufficient funding that you've discussed. We've passed, as you well know, the National Defense Authorization Act and the Appropriations Act through the House. The Senate's passed the authorization, but we've got to get the appropriations passed through the Senate. And I would just say in closing that one of the things that has become very clear in my short time here is how important it is we remind our colleagues that we cannot treat defense spending the way that we treat every other part of the budget and every other part of the appropriations process. But we've got to recognize that if we fail to get this right, and if we fail to get the resources that our military needs to defend and protect us, doesn't matter how important we think tax cuts are, it doesn't matter how important we think health reform is, it doesn't matter how important any of the other matters we deal with are. If we fail to get this fundamental issue right, then none of those other things will matter. And so we are very grateful. I'm very grateful for your being very frank and direct. We urge you to continue to do that. And we're continuing to fight here. We're going to need some very significant reforms to the entire budget process in order to be able to get out of the rut that we've been in and the real damage that's been done with the continuing resolutions for multiple years. But I thank very much the committee for its time, and I thank you very much for your service and for being here.
If I could respond to the Congresswoman, it'd be remiss if I didn't put a dot on this, because I know many of you in this room have heard this before, but to go on the record, we were asked to compute in the United States Navy what 9 continuing resolutions have cost us. It has cost us $4 billion. That's not lost opportunity. That's $4 billion in cash in a trash can with lighter fluid, burn it. And that's the impact that continuing resolutions have, looking back on a totally quantitative basis.
Yep. Well, and I appreciate that very much. And of course, in addition to that, we're to the point where we're seeing an impact in lives as well, as you know far better than I do. And the other piece I would just point out is we're seeing an impact in terms of aid to our adversaries. And again, the fact that one body up here is unable to do its job, the fact that the Senate is unable to do its constitutional obligation to pass an appropriations bill for defense doesn't absolve the House of Representatives from doing its job and its duty. And we are very committed to making sure that we do that and we get it done and get the United States Senate to pass it as well so we can get it to the President's desk for signature. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congresswoman Cheney. And we particularly appreciate your appreciation of your constituents, Secretary and Ms. Spencer, who are here today. And Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, as a grateful Navy dad myself, thank you for your candid remarks, and thank you for following through on trying to address the issue of this catastrophic series of events and the Navy's plans to get back on course. Many of us have visited the Fitzgerald at Yokosuka, Japan, and our sympathy has been underscored for the families who have been so gruesomely affected. We invite the Navy to return and update the subcommittees on your progress in a few months. Thank you, Margaret Dean, for your service. This hearing is adjourned.